The crypto millionaire who lost everything trying to look rich, Chad Bolton, could still summon the smell of fryer grease whenever he wanted to, and sometimes when he didn't. It lived in the back room of the seafood place in North Miami Beach, where he'd bust tables at 19, a low-ceilinged space behind the kitchen where the dish machine breathed steam and the floor mats were always slick. Years later, after the waterfront house, after the watches, after the private dinners under heat lamps and Brickell with men who introduced themselves by their net worth, that smell would surface without warning, always late, always on the nights he couldn't sleep, which by then were most of them. At 24, Chad had become a millionaire faster than anyone who knew him believed was possible. At 26, he lay awake doing math he already knew the answer to.
The story really began in a one-bedroom apartment with carpet the color of weak coffee and a window unit that rattled all night like something was caught in its throat. Chad grew up working class in a way that didn't leave much room for metaphor about it. His mother was a nurse's assistant who came home smelling of disinfectant and other people's illness. His father drove trucks until the diabetes took his eyes, and then drove nothing and sat by the window instead. Nobody in the Bolton family discussed equity or portfolios or tax shelters. They discussed overtime. Overtime was the only lever anyone in that apartment understood, and they pulled it until their bodies gave out. Chad had been a different kind of kid, quiet, the obsessive type. While the other boys ran a half-court game in the lot below, he vanished into the internet, coding tutorials, finance explainers, the strange glowing rabbit holes of a teenager looking for a door out. When the pandemic stalled the world, Chad found crypto, and crypto found him back. It started as curiosity, then it became obsession. Then, in the private way a young man decides things about himself, it became destiny. He taught himself the architecture of it, smart contracts, decentralized finance, the manic seasonal logic of meme coin cycles, liquidity pools, leverage, token launches, the crowd psychology that moved underneath all of it like a tide under a boat. He slept 4 hours a night and watched charts the way a family watches a heart monitor in a hospital room, as though the green line climbing meant a life was being saved. His first real break came from a gaming token nobody else took seriously. $6,000 became $200,000 in 4 months. Then there was another project, and another. He was early every single time. He was lucky, too, though he would never have used that word. Luck implied the thing could have gone differently, and Chad needed to believe it couldn't. By 23, he had crossed $1 million liquid. By 24, nearly $7 million on paper. The number had a strange weightlessness to it, like helium. It lifted him, but it never quite felt attached. The money changed everyone around him faster than it changed him. At first, he stayed small in his habits. Plain black tees. The same dented Honda Accord with the check engine light he'd learned to ignore. Lunch at the Jamaican spot 2 blocks from the apartment. Oxtail and rice. The woman at the register calling him baby like she had since he was a kid. But Miami has a particular curriculum, and the first lesson it teaches is that having money is not the same as money being seen. In Miami, wealth that no one witnesses barely counts. This was triply true in the crowd Chad now moved through, and after the bull market detonated, it became the only law that mattered. He started showing up to the rooftop parties, Brickell, South Beach, Glass Towers, where 22-year-olds ordered $1,000 bottles and discussed market caps the way generals discuss terrain they intend to take. Lamborghinis idled at the valet like ornaments nobody planned to drive far. Men he'd never met told them about their token launches and their offshore structures with the bright, hollow urgency of people convincing themselves. Chad nodded. He was learning the language, and the language was performance. It was at one of these, a penthouse with a wraparound terrace and a DJ nobody was listening to, that he met Isabella Laurent. Dark brown hair, green eyes, and a kind of stillness that read, in that room of noise, as the loudest thing present. Not the manufactured confidence of the women who orbited crypto money, that bright, brittle attention that switched off the instant it sensed a smaller wallet. Isabella's was older than that. It was the ease of someone raised close enough to wealth that she had never once had to mention it. Her family owned commercial real estate up and down South Florida, Coral Gables money, yacht club money, the kind that measured itself in decades rather than quarters. What Chad noticed first was that she didn't look at his watch. "What do you actually build?" she asked him, maybe 10 minutes into their first conversation. The question stopped him. Nobody asked that. Everyone asked how much he'd made and how fast and what he was in now. No one had ever asked what he made, as if he were a person who produced things rather than a number that fluctuated. They started seeing each other. In the beginning, Isabella liked him precisely for what he hadn't yet sanded off. The hunger was still on him. So was the gratitude, that disbelieving, almost reverent way he had of looking at an ordinary evening, a good meal, a city skyline, as if none of it were owed to him, and all of it might be taken back. He looked at his own life like a man watching a magic trick he couldn't explain. And then, by degrees so small that no single one of them could be blamed, that started to go. It began with the condo. Chad left the rattling apartment for a high floor in a glass tower over Biscayne Bay. 43rd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, white marble that showed every footprint, an HOA fee that by itself exceeded what he used to pay in rent. He told himself it was an investment. Everyone said real estate was an investment, which was how you knew it usually wasn't. Then the watches. Then the dinners that cost what his mother made in a week. Then the clothes and the particular fatigue of learning which brands the room respected and which ones marked you as new. Then the networking, which was really just spending money in the company of other people spending money, all of them confusing proximity for friendship. Then the Lamborghini Urus, black over red. He bought it for Isabella after she'd mentioned, idly, almost as a joke, that she'd always preferred SUVs to low sports cars. She cried when he set the keys in her hand. "You're insane," she laughed, and kissed him like he'd become something larger than himself. That was the feeling. Not the being rich, the being seen being rich, being admired, being, after 24 years of overtime and ignored check engine lights, finally and unmistakably enough. The real turning came at a dinner in Coconut Grove, at the home of one of Isabella's family friends. The house sat on a canal with private access to the bay. Glass walls held the whole sunset and handed it back doubled off the water. A yacht waited behind the property the way a sentence waits for its period. Chad heard almost none of the conversation that night. His attention had fixed on the house and would not let go. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because of what it seemed to promise: permanence, respect, the sense of having arrived somewhere and being allowed to stay. He watched Isabella move through the rooms without thinking about them, the way you move through your own home, and he understood with a small, cold clarity that he had been moving through his own life like a guest, afraid of overstaying. That night, in the dark of the condo, he stared at the ceiling. "I want a house," he said. Isabella turned toward him. "You have a beautiful condo." "No, a real house." She was quiet for a moment, reading him in a way that made him want to look away. "You don't have to prove anything," she said. But he did. Somewhere underneath everything, he was certain that he did. 3 months later, Chad bought the mansion. 8,000 square feet, modern lines, all glass and pale stone, a private dock, and a straight shot to Biscayne Bay. An infinity pool that spilled toward the water, so that on a still evening, you couldn't see where the one ended and the other began. 6 bedrooms for 2 people. An outdoor kitchen he would use perhaps a dozen times. And the other numbers, the ones that didn't photograph. The mortgage, the insurance that climbed every hurricane season, the property taxes that tightened his stomach each quarter, the maintenance that arrived in a steady procession of men in trucks. It was the kind of house that looked flawless on Instagram and felt like a held breath on a spreadsheet. Chad didn't care. Crypto was still climbing. Every dip recovered. Every dollar he put in came back married to several more. Online, everyone spoke as though the future had already been distributed and they had simply gotten there first. The housewarming became something people talked about for months. Influencers, founders, two athletes, a rapper whose presence Chad couldn't quite believe, even while shaking his hand, drone footage, a champagne tower. Chad stood on the balcony over the canal with the bass moving through the floor and into his chest, and he thought, with total sincerity, the most dangerous thought a man in his position can think: I made it. That was the inciting incident, not the crash. The house. Because the house quietly rewrote the rules of his life. It stopped being a luxury, the thing you buy because you can, and became a requirement, the thing you must keep affording or else lose everything it stands for. And a requirement built on volatile money is not an asset. It is a countdown. Over the following year, his life expanded in every direction at once. Private school deposits for children who didn't exist yet, a boat membership, designer furniture chosen by a decorator who used the word story a great deal, security systems, landscaping crews, dock repairs, a pool that required its own specialist. The spending was enormous, but the spending was not, in the end, the thing that killed him. Leverage was the thing. Chad had become convinced, the way the whole ecosystem was convinced, that the market would simply continue. So he borrowed against his holdings, then borrowed against the borrowed positions, then funneled the proceeds into newer projects, promising returns that should have frightened him, and instead only excited him. Everyone he respected was doing the same. The entire scene ran on borrowed confidence, and confidence during a bull market feels exactly like wealth. Until it stops. The first crack was almost silent. A project Chad had backed heavily fell 70% overnight when a rumor about regulators spread through a few large group chats. Then a protocol he was exposed to got drained in a hack. Then Bitcoin began to slide, slowly at first, the way a thing slides before it falls. Then the slide became a rout, and within weeks, billions of dollars simply stopped existing across the market. Chad watched the charts go down day after day like elevators with the cables cut. 7 million on paper became 4. 4 became 3. 3 kept going. He told himself, as everyone told themselves, that it was temporary. Every prior crash had recovered. Hold the line, diamond hands, the future is still ours. But the liquidity didn't come back. Buyers evaporated. Several of the projects he was deepest in collapsed outright. One founder boarded a plane and didn't return. Another became a subject of an investigation Chad read about on his phone at 2 a.m. Then the margin calls began, and Chad started waking before dawn with the sheets soaked through. The bills, meanwhile, kept their appointments. The house did not read the news. The insurance did not extend professional courtesy. The taxes were indifferent. A storm chewed up part of the dock, and the repair quote arrived the same week the pool filtration failed, and the Eurus payment posted, serene and unchanged, as though nothing anywhere had moved at all. One evening, Chad sat alone at the kitchen island with 3 spreadsheets open, while rain came sideways off the bay and hammered the glass. He had been avoiding the bottom row of the last sheet for an hour. When he finally let himself look at it, the conclusion was no longer arguable. At this rate, they would lose the house inside a year, probably less. Isabella came in wearing one of his oversized hoodies, her feet bare on the cold marble. "You haven't eaten," she said. "I'm figuring it out." "You've been figuring it out for weeks." It came out of him before he could stop it. "Because I'm trying to save everything." The kitchen went silent except for the rain. He heard the ugliness of his own voice still hanging in the air, and he hated it. Isabella didn't flinch. She pulled out the stool across from him and sat. "Talk to me," she said. "Honestly." And for the first time, he did. The loans, the exposure, the positions that had stopped being positions and become only losses. The projects that no longer answered. The debt, the real shape of the debt, which he had not said aloud to anyone, including himself. When he finished, he couldn't look at her. He waited for the disappointment, the disgust, the beginning of the end. Instead, she asked quietly, "How bad is it, really?" He made himself say it. "We might lose the house." The words went down like swallowed glass. Isabella leaned back, not shocked, not crying, thinking, and that frightened him more than tears would have, because it meant she was already somewhere ahead of him. "You think losing the house means losing me?" she said. His head came up, because that was it exactly, the thing underneath the thing, and she had named it without effort. Everything he had built was load-bearing on that house. It wasn't property. It was evidence, proof he belonged among these people, proof he deserved her, proof he had outrun the apartment with the rattling window unit and was never, ever going back. Strip the house away, and he was certain he would simply become invisible again, the busboy who smelled of fryer grease. "You don't understand," he said. "No," she said. "I understand completely." She crossed to the windows over the canal, where the rain ran down the glass in sheets. "My family has lost money before." He blinked. "What? You think old money means the money never stops?" She didn't turn around. "My grandfather nearly lost all of it in the 80s. My father rebuilt the business twice after the bottom fell out from under it. I grew up hearing those stories at dinner, the way other kids hear fairy tales." Chad stared at her back. "Then how?" "Because they understood something you haven't gotten to yet." Now she turned. The water light moved across her face. "Real wealth survives embarrassment. That's the whole secret. Everything else is just decoration that can burn." It landed harder than any number on any screen had landed in months. Because sitting there, Chad finally saw the architecture of his own decisions and understood that almost none of them had been financial. The Urus was not transportation. It was an argument he was making about himself. The mansion was not shelter. It was an identity with a mortgage. He had constructed a life whose monthly operating cost required him to remain spectacularly, uninterruptedly successful forever, with no allowance made for a single bad season. That isn't wealth. That's a hostage situation, and he was both the captive and the man holding the gun. The next several months were a slow education in the cost of trying to save face and savings at the same time. Chad did the worst things first, because they felt like action. He doubled down on risky trades, chasing the recovery that refused to come. He put money into new startups at exactly the moment money was leaving them. He spent nights working the phones, calling other founders, building alliances. But most of them were underwater too, treading hard, and a drowning man makes a poor lifeguard. Miami itself changed around him, which somehow made it worse. The restaurants that had roared with crypto money went quiet. The valet lines thinned of exotic cars. People who had called him constantly stopped picking up. And the online confidence that had carried everyone curdled almost overnight into online blame, long threads about who had lied, who had dumped, who should have known. One afternoon, a lender's final notice arrived in his inbox. Chad read it in his home office, while, beyond the glass, two boats drifted across the canal in the unhurried way of objects that belonged to people with nothing pressing to do. For the first time in years, he felt poor. Not actually poor, something more specific and more humiliating. Overextended, house poor, asset-rich on a statement, and cash-starved in life, locked inside a beautiful building he could no longer afford to keep the lights on in. A gorgeous prison with a private dock. That night he broke, not loudly, not in any way that would have looked like much from the outside. He simply went and sat at the edge of the pool a little after midnight, feet in the water, the underwater lights glowing a chemical blue, and put his head in his hands. Isabella found him there. She sat down beside him and put her own feet in. "I failed," he said. "You're still breathing. I dragged us into this. You built this. And now I'm tearing it down." "No," she said. "You're learning. Expensively, but you're learning." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "A few $100,000 a lesson." She studied him in the blue light. "What are you actually afraid of? Not the bank, the real thing. He answered without having to search for it, that you'll finally see who I actually am. And who's that? A guy from nowhere who's been pretending he belongs here. Isabella shook her head slowly. You still think the house is the thing. She gestured at all of it. The pool, the glass, the dock, the water. Chad, this is drywall and concrete and a good view. That's all it has ever been. It's not just the house. I know, she said gently. It's what you decided the house says about you, and that's the part you get to take back. 2 weeks later, he sat across a desk from a man named Raphael, a financial advisor Isabella's father had recommended, in the tone of someone recommending a surgeon. Raphael was in his 60s, Cuban, unhurried, with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose, and a way of going quiet that made you want to fill the silence with confessions. He had spent decades helping wealthy families survive their worst years, and he had clearly seen versions of Chad before. He went through everything without comment. Assets, liabilities, the loans against the loans, cash flow, burn rate, the rate at which the house alone consumed money whether anyone was home or not. When he was done, he took off the glasses and set them on the desk. You have an income problem dressed up as a pride problem, he said. What does that mean? It means you can survive this. Raphael folded his hands. Financially, you can survive it. What you cannot survive is the version of this where you keep paying to protect an image. The image is the most expensive thing you own, and it doesn't appreciate. Then he laid it out, plainly, the way a doctor names a course of treatment that is going to hurt. Sell the URIS, cut the memberships, all of them. Cut spending now, not gradually. Restructure the debt before the debt restructured him. Liquidate the remaining speculative positions and stop pretending they were going to turn. Build towards stable income. And, above all of it, sell the house. Before the market makes you. There is a great deal of difference between selling and being sold. Chad felt sick. No, Raphael didn't react to the word at all. You can hold on to it until the bank arrives with the locks, he said. Or you can walk out on your own feet, with capital in your pocket and your name intact. Those are the 2 doors. There is no third one where you keep everything. Chad looked past him, out the window, toward the smudge of a blue that was the bay. Everything in him refused. Selling the house meant the whispers, the speculation, the threads online, the relatives who would say they'd seen it coming. It meant walking backward in front of an audience. Then Raphael asked the question that took the floor out from under all of it. If the house disappeared tomorrow, gone, overnight, would your skills disappear with it? Chad said nothing, because the answer was no, and they both knew it, and the silence was the sound of him hearing it. The problem had never been that he lacked ability. The problem was that his success had inflated his ego faster than it had grown his judgment, and the gap between the two was exactly the size of the mortgage. That evening, Chad walked the house alone, room by room, like a man taking inventory of a life. The floating staircase he'd shown off to everyone who came. The wall of wine he barely drank. The kitchen built for a chef he'd never hired. The dock, the balcony, the master suite with its impossible view of the canal going silver in the last light. He remembered how safe he'd been, so sure it would make him feel. And he understood now that the opposite had been true the entire time. The house had never belonged to him. He had belonged to it. Every month it sent its demands, and he met them. Every tick of the market threatened it, and so every decision he made bent itself around keeping it fed. He had mistaken the weight of it for security. It had only ever been weight. He had not built freedom. He had built obligations and dressed them in good lighting. Near midnight, Isabella joined him on the dock. The water moved against the pilings, patient, indifferent. He took a long breath. I think we have to sell it. She nodded, not relieved, not victorious, just steady. I know. You really don't care?
She smiled, and there was sadness in it, but not for the house. I care about what happens to you if we don't. I've watched this house cost you your sleep for a year. I'd like to see what you're like without it. Chad looked down at the black water carrying its broken pieces of moon. I wanted to prove I belonged in this world. Isabella slid her hand into his. You don't belong because of the house, she said. You belong because you can lose it and still be standing here. That's the part nobody at those parties ever has to find out about themselves. You're about to. The unwinding took the better part of a year. They sold the mansion before foreclosure was ever a word anyone said aloud, not at a loss that would ruin them, but at one that wounded Chad somewhere pride lives and doesn't easily heal. The Orris went next, and the seller's remorse he expected to feel never arrived. Mostly he felt the small, surprising lightness of one fewer payment with his name on it. The memberships lapsed. The decorator stopped calling. They moved into a smaller house in Coral Gables. No waterfront, no dock, no infinity pool dissolving into the bay. A good house, modest by the standards of the life he'd been living, ordinary by the standards of the life he'd come from, and somehow it was the second comparison that took him the longest to make peace with. At first, the smallness embarrassed him. He caught himself bracing when people asked where he lived now. But the embarrassment thinned over the months, and underneath it, he found something he hadn't expected. The smaller house was quiet. It did not demand things of him. He slept in it. He rebuilt carefully this time, and slowly, which was its own discipline for a man who had made his money in 4-month miracles. No leverage, no positions that required a prayer. He started by consulting for blockchain companies instead of gambling on them, selling the one thing the crash had genuinely made him an expert in, which was how these things fall apart and what it looks like just before they do. Then he founded a software security firm that helped crypto startups avoid the exact disasters he had lived through with his own money. Real revenue, real contracts, cash flow he could see coming. Slow money, boring money, the healthy, unglamorous kind that no one posts about because there is no photograph that captures the feeling of a problem you no longer have. And over time, he noticed the change in himself, the way you notice a fever finally breaking. The dread receded. He slept through the night and stopped reaching for his phone before his eyes were open. He laughed more and meant it. Things with Isabella got better. Not because anything dramatic was repaired, but because their conversations were no longer just fear wearing the costume of luxury, two people performing a life at each other across a marble island. One evening, years on, now, Chad stood in the backyard of the smaller house, working a grill while Isabella moved down the row of plants with a watering can. The sky over Coral Gables had gone the deep orange it gets in summer, and a plane crawled across it toward Miami Beach, full of people arriving to be impressed by the city. He realized, standing there with smoke in his eyes, that he was happier than he had ever been in the mansion. Not because he had less, because less of him belonged to anyone or anything else. He understood, finally, the thing no one says out loud at the top of a bull market. Lifestyle creep isn't merely spending more as you earn more. It's the quiet construction of a life that punishes you the moment you slow down. A machine that runs only at full speed and eats you if you ever stop to rest. True wealth was never the biggest house on the water. It was the ability to sleep soundly inside whatever house you actually owned. He still loved beautiful homes. He still slowed the car for the waterfront estates along the canals near Biscayne Bay, still admired a good machine in a valet line. But he saw them differently now, not as verdicts on a man's worth, just as things. Things that could widen a life when they were held loosely, or swallow it whole when they were gripped by someone who needed them to mean something. Late one night, sitting outside in the ordinary dark, Isabella asked him a question he would carry for the rest of his life. If you could go back, she said, would you still buy the mansion? He thought about it honestly, which is the only way she'd have accepted the answer. Then he smiled. Yes. She turned to look at him, surprised. Why?
Because losing it is the only thing that ever taught me what I get to keep. The breeze came through the trees and moved over them, warm and salt-edged and free. And for the first time in years, owning a fraction of what he'd once owned, and finally owning himself, Chad Bolton felt rich.